Chapter 25 of The Black Motor Car. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Painter. The Black Motor Car by BURLAND. Chapter 25. The Long Road. Holmes set his face grimly as the great car shot forward into the fog. The cold white mist beat into his face like a stream of liquid ice. He gripped the sides of his steel seat with both hands. For the rest, he trusted to Providence and the keen eyes and firm hands of Lord Harry Quay. Home was not used to motor cars, and a ride of this sort was calculated to try the nerves of an experienced man. The fog and darkness closed in on him like the walls of a vault. The engine throbbed and beat beneath him like the continual whir of a loom. The air whistled past his ears like the sharp hiss of a serpent. Behind and on either side lay an impenetrable blackness. Before him a patch of muddy road rushing toward him from a white sea of mist. Lord Harry Quay drove like a madman, his eyes glued on the brown road and the ridge of grass on either side which marked out his course. He knew the danger that lurked in the darkness, but he had no time to think of it. His mind was riveted on a single object, and for that he was prepared to risk everything. As the minutes passed and the miles flashed by him, all mental and physical fatigue vanished. He became a machine moving relentlessly onward, one with the pulsating shafts and cylinders beneath him, a soulless automaton quickened to life by a single breath, the voice of a dead girl crying out to him to slay and spare not. Fast as they drove, and Lord Harry got every ounce of power out of his engines, they did not come up to the object of their chase. Every moment they expected to see the lights of Jordison's car, but nothing came to them out of the white mist ahead. Lord Harry cursed aloud. He began to realize that he was beaten. Since the black car had passed them, there had been no turning from the one long straight road. It was quite certain that they had followed the right track, yet Jordison had eluded them. Beyond the park wall the main road ran straight on to the ferry across the Yoke Fleet, while a by-road skirted this wall and formed a connecting link between the old Roman causeway and the London road. It was quite clear that Jordison would not attempt to cross the ferry, and Lord Harry Quay steered by the wall on his right and dashed into the narrow lane. A shower of mud and stones, and a jolt that nearly flung both the men from their seats, warned him that he must slow down if he did not wish to rip the tires off the wheels. He reduced the speed to 30 miles an hour. The road ran slightly uphill, and in less than a minute the car emerged from the carpet of fog that covered the lower ground. The moon was shining brightly overhead in a clear sky. Both men peered eagerly ahead. At the top of the slope, half a mile away, a bright light flashed for a second and disappeared. "We're on his heels," said Home. "Can't you go faster?" "Certainly, but there is the risk of breaking down altogether." "We must take the risk," Home replied. "Jordison has taken it." Lord Harry said nothing, but gradually slipped the car on to the top speed. They could see clearly now, and the chief danger lay in the roughness of the road, which appeared to be made of loose round pebbles and mud. As they shot forward, the stones rattled all around them, and the mud spurted up in a continuous stream. The car had as yet no mudguards fixed onto it. When they reached the top of the hill, they saw a light a mile ahead of them. "He's gaining," muttered Home. "He has been going downhill," Lord Harry replied. Now, hold tight." The car shot down the hill like a stone from a sling. Holmes's brain was dizzy with the roar and rush of the air that swept past him. He clutched the seat with both hands. He imagined the sensation was like that of falling from a great height. He wondered how his companion could keep his seat and both hands on the steering wheel. Then he noticed that Lord Harry Quee had strapped himself in with a broad leather belt. He shuddered to think of what would happen if the car were to overturn, but his heart was full of gratitude and admiration. His friend was risking his life for the sake of a woman who loved another man. It was indeed a miracle that the car was not wrecked in that headlong descent, and the successful passage of those 2 short miles of down gradient would have proved a fine advertisement for any makers in the world. The machine leapt and crashed down the slope like a living thing. Every now and then it seemed as though all 4 wheels were off the ground and that the car was flying through space. Then there would come a grinding crash and shock, and a shower of mud would fly up before them like spray from the bows of a vessel. As luck would have it, the road was now almost free from stones. But, broad though the car was, it rocked from side to side like a ship in a storm, and it seemed to Holmes's inexperienced eye as though every swing of its great iron frame would hurl it over on its side into the hedge. The whole descent occupied less than a minute, but the sensations of an hour were crowded into that brief space of time. Home gave a sigh of relief as they neared the broad white stretch of the London road that ran north and south to right angles of them. The light was still visible to the north and was now less than half a mile ahead. For one brief moment Lord Harry shut off the supply of petrol and applied the brake. They swung round the corner on 2 wheels and shot out onto the smooth surface of the road. In a few seconds Lord Harry had worked his engines up to their top speed, and the strain on his eyes and mind was at last in some measure relieved. The moon shone clear on a broad, smooth road, and the speed was terrific. The journey was luxurious compared to what they had just experienced in the fog and through the morass of that narrow lane. They could now see the black car itself, and the smell of its petrol came back to them. But Lord Harry marvelled at its silence. The throb of his own engines could be heard at least a mile away. He realized that if once the moon went behind a cloud, and if Jordison cared to risk putting out his lights, they would have nothing to follow but their own instincts, and would have to guess at the probable route Jordison would take. Lord Harry looked up at the sky. A heavy cloud of white vapour was already near the moon. Then he looked at the car ahead. He was gaining on it, and he wondered if he could reach it before the earth was plunged into darkness. Then suddenly, as though in answer to his thoughts, the lights before him vanished, and he had nothing to follow but the outline of the black car on the white road. Home had no doubt that they would overtake Jordison before 20 minutes had elapsed, and he began to ask himself what would happen if they got alongside of him. Both he and Lord Harry were unarmed, and he realized that they had to do with desperate men. Half a mile away from the parting of the roads, they were so close to Jordison's car that they could hear the hissing of the wheels and the sound of voices. A second later, the white strip of road vanished as suddenly as though it had been blotted off the map, and a veil of darkness descended over the whole scene. Nothing was visible but the fan of yellow light that swept on before them, but they could still hear the sound of wheels on the soft road. It would, however, be impossible to tell whether Jordison had taken the right or left turning until they had shot well past the signpost, and a wrong turning at this point would mean the loss of at least a mile in the chase. Lord Harry Quee peered ahead, but could see nothing. Their own lamps illuminated the road for nearly 50 yards in front of them, but beyond that all was darkness. "Which is it to be?" he said quickly, "the right or the left?" For answer, Home took a coin from his pocket and held it between his open palms. "Head's right, tail's left," he said. "Very well," Lord Harry replied. "It is just as good a way as any other." Home exposed the coin and held it down to one of the side lamps. "Heads," he said, and replaced the coin in his pocket. Lord Harry took the car to the right of the road, and a few seconds later the white signpost flashed up like a ghost on their left, and vanished. It was an anxious moment. Both men listened attentively. Then Lord Harry burst out with a "Thank God!" The faint noise in front of them continued. Fortune had been with them in this one thing, at any rate. "We shall overtake it now," said Lord Harry. "There is not another break in the road for 10 miles, and then he dare not take it. He would have to slow down to take a right-angle turn. For 30 miles he will have to go straight ahead on the north road." "And what do we do when we overtake it?" asked Home. "We go alongside and talk." "I'm afraid Jordison won't waste words on us," he said dryly, "and I don't think that it would be advisable to get too close to him. We had better hang on his heels till daylight and give the alarm. The news will be all over England in an hour, and he cannot possibly escape." "You're probably right," Lord Harry answered, "but I intend to have a go at him myself. I wish to meet the gentleman." "Few that have met him wish to do so again," Home replied, and the two men relapsed into silence. The 2 cars tore on through the night. The hedgerows ran past in streaming lines of brown, and the road spun toward them like a strip of paper from a tape machine. Jordison relit his lamps, and the glow of them ran before the pursuers like a cloud of fire. Up gentle slopes and down long gradients, and over wide stretches of level ground, they rushed at the same headlong speed. Sleeping villages burst into sight and vanished like scenes that are disclosed from darkness by a flash of lightning. And inch by inch the grey car crept up to the object of its pursuit, till at last a black mass of metal crept out of the darkness into the edge of the broad fan of light that streamed from the Blériot lamps. "It is a long road," said Lord Harry Quay, "but the end of it is in sight." Farther and still farther the black car crept into the light. The 2 young men could now see the backs of the occupants. A tall man had his hands on the steering gear, and a small squat figure looked back at them. They could see his face, white in the glare of the lamps, coarse-featured and evil. "Lip," said Home, as though in answer to a silent query on the part of his companion. "We've a tough couple to deal with, Quay. I wish I had my revolver. It's the devil's own luck that I left it in Upwithing when we went off in such a hurry." "You've 2 hands," cried Lord Harry, "and I wouldn't care to have my throat in your fingers." Home smiled. Lord Harry had not been in the clutches of William Jordison. Then suddenly the squat figure turned right round and flung his arm over the back of the car. A second later there was a flash and a report, and a bullet sang past Lord Harry's ear. He laughed. He was strung up to so high a pitch of excitement that he would have faced a Maxim gun without fear. There was another flash, and yet another, and 2 bullets in quick succession struck the ground in front of the car. Lord Harry laughed again. The aim was so palpably ridiculous. He chuckled to see his opponents fling away their ammunition on an invulnerable road. There was another flash, and a metallic ring, as the bullet struck the honeycombing in front of the bonnet. The cars were now a bare 20 yards apart. "Keep back!" cried Home. "We can hang on to their heels all right till daylight." "Keep back, be damned!" said Lord Harry. "They can't shoot straight. I will run their cursed car down in 2 minutes." Home watched Lip refill his revolver and take careful aim over the back of the car, and he noticed that the barrel of the revolver pointed downward. Then there came 4 flashes, one after the other, as quick as a man can count. 2 struck the road, 1 hit the hub of the right-hand wheel, and the 4th found its mark. It struck the tyre with a dull thud and hiss of air. The car sank slowly over and wrenched the wheel out of Lord Harry's hand. The next instant the tyre was ripped off the wheel like a piece of paper. The great car swerved to the right, and a ton of metal came full tilt into a tree. Home was flung from his seat in a crumpled ball, and shot like a bullet into the hedge. Lord Harry Quay, still strapped to his seat, was crushed against the tree like a fly on a wall. In a second of time he had traversed a longer road than any marked on the map of England, and had found the end of it. End of chapter 25.
Chapter 26 of The Black Motor Car. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Drew Conway. The Black Motor Car by BURLAND. Chapter 26. The Tomb. When Home came to his senses and opened his eyes, he was in darkness. He sat up and tried to collect his thoughts. At first, he could not remember what had happened. Then he recollected the long chase through the night, the swerve of the car, the crash, and after that, nothing more. He had a confused idea in his brain that he was still lying where he had fallen, and that the blackness around him was that of night, but as his mind grew clearer, he realized that no night was ever so dark as this. Then the awful thought burst upon him that he had been blinded by the accident. He felt in his pocket for some matches, but could not find the box. Then he touched the ground by his side. It did not feel to him like the road. It was hard, smooth and cold like solid rock. It was inconceivable that he should have fallen on such a place and escaped with his life. He could not imagine where he had been taken to, but he guessed that Jordison had some hand in the matter. With the idea of blindness uppermost in his mind, he unlaced one of his heavy-nailed boots, and taking it in his hand, struck the rocky floor several times with all his strength. 2 or 3 sparks flashed out from the impact, and never had such small sparks of light meant so much to a man. He shouted with joy, and the noise reverberated like distant thunder, till it died away in a whisper. He thrust his foot back into the boot and laced it up carefully. He realized now that he was in some subterranean cavern or passage, and a new terror seized him. Was it possible that Jordison had thrown him into some underground prison, which was destined to be his tomb? He pictured to himself a lingering death from thirst and starvation, with never a glimmer of light to cheer his last moments, and with never a sound to break the silence but the dying gasps of his own breath. Then he cursed himself for a coward and rose to his feet. He shook off the cloud that the darkness had woven about his brain, and his mind once more became keen and vigorous, the mind of a man who is in a tight place and who has to exert all his energies to get out of it. He stepped cautiously forward, for he knew not what lay before him. It was possible that a precipice might suddenly fall away beneath his feet. He moved several yards in one direction and encountered nothing. Then he turned to the right, and a few steps brought him up against a dead wall. He turned sharply round and retraced his steps, counting them as he walked. When he had taken 8 paces, he encountered another wall. Keeping one hand on the stone, he moved along it, expecting every minute to again meet some further obstacle to his progress. But when he had walked for a few minutes, he came to the conclusion that he was in a long passage. He quickly obtained confirmation of this by leaving the wall once more and crossing over to the other side, now some 10 paces distant. He resolved to explore the passage from end to end, and continued in the same direction. In an hour's time he stepped into some water. He thought at first that it might be a mere puddle, but when he tried to skirt it, he found that it reached to the opposite wall. He placed his hand against the rock and splashed cautiously forward. The cold water rose to his ankles, and as he proceeded grew deeper and deeper till it reached his knees. Then he stopped, felt once more in his pockets for the matches which he always carried with him, and searched every inch of the lining carefully for a single match, which is often to be found about the clothes of a confirmed smoker. But he was unsuccessful. Matches are cheap enough in England, but at that moment he would have given half of his whole worldly goods for a single box of them. The darkness was becoming heavy and suffocating like the folds of a velvet pall. He was more hopelessly lost in it than a sailor who tries to pick his way through an unknown and unlighted channel in a fog. Only the stone of the passage and the cold water were realities. He moved forward another few yards and the water reached his coat. It had begun to deepen more rapidly. His feet no longer touched the hard rock, but sunk into a soft bed of mud or sand. An idea suddenly seized him. He gathered up some of the water in his hands and lapped a few drops with his tongue. The water was salt. He turned around and, retracting his steps, came back to the dry ground. Then he sat down in his dripping clothes and reasoned things out. It was clear that this unknown tunnel was connected in some way or other with one of the creeks, or even with the sea. It was possible that the pool was merely an accumulation of salt water which had filtered through the rock and earth above, but on the other hand it was conceivable that the tunnel emerged in the sea. If so, there was a chance that the opening was uncovered at low tide. Holm had no means of ascertaining the state of the tide at that particular moment, for he had no idea of the time and did not even know whether it was day or night. It would, however, be easy to find out whether the water was tidal, and if so, whether the tide was rising or falling. He went down to the pool and, placing a shilling on the very edge of the water, waited patiently for the information he required. In a few minutes' time he found that the water had receded from the coin. It was clear that the pool was tidal and that the tide was running out. But it was just possible that the tide had neared its lowest point and that it would only fall a few inches more, in which case there was no hope for an exit into the open air. He carefully felt the ground running from the water's edge into the tunnel behind him. For 3 yards it was wet, and then his fingers encountered dry rock. The distance represented, as far as he could judge, a fall of about 6 inches into the water. It was, therefore, evident that the tide had only just turned. With 12 or 15 feet to fall, it was possible that the mouth of the tunnel might be completely uncovered. He stooped down and, peering across the water into the darkness, waited for some glimmer of light, the first indication of escape from this tomb of rock. When he had waited an hour, shivering, hungry, and tormented with thirst, it suddenly occurred to him that there might be a bend in the tunnel which would absorb the first weak rays of the sun, filtering through a mass of green water. He moved several yards forward to the water's edge, but still there was darkness. Then it occurred to him that it might possibly be night, and there would be no light to guide him. He debated with himself whether, after all, it would not be better to take off his clothes, plunge boldly into the water, and swim as far as the roof of the tunnel would permit. When another hour had passed and still no glimmer of light came from the black wall of darkness, he decided to take this somewhat desperate course. He took off all his clothes and walked into the icy water till it reached his waist. Then he struck out boldly. Yet as he started, the thought came to him that Jordison had brought him to this place, that Jordison had left him unfettered and free to roam where he pleased, and that it was hardly likely that Jordison had left him any loophole for escape. Holm was a powerful swimmer, and he had no fears for his own safety so long as nothing out of the way interrupted his progress. But it was strange work swimming there in the darkness. hearing the hollow splash of his steady strokes and bumping against the wet rocks that closed him in on the other side. When he had gone 100 yards, he tried to touch the bottom, but found that he was out of his depth. Raising his hand above his head, he touched the roof, and the impact sent him under for a few seconds. After another 100 yards, he again lifted his arm, but found that the roof was no closer to him. At the end of the other 100 yards, he could not touch it, and sinking suddenly down, reached the sand at the bottom. Then all at once out of the darkness came a far-off gleam of light, no more than a patch of dark bluish grey against an inky background, but still the first ray from the outer world. He swam more quickly and more powerfully, and the water bubbled against his head as it bubbles at the bow of a boat. In a few minutes' time the patch became lighter and more definite in shape. In the joy of his discovery he did not notice the fine network of lines that crossed it. His head was half buried in the water, and he drove his body forward with long powerful strokes. Then, as he lifted his arm out of the water to make a stroke, his fingers wrapped hard against something, slid past it to his elbow, and his whole body came crash against a framework of iron. He raised his other hand, and catching hold of a stout bar, examined the obstacle which had brought his progress to such an abrupt termination. As far as he could see in the darkness, which could only have been regarded as twilight by one who had grown accustomed to the absolute darkness of the tunnel, he was confronted by a great screen made of thick bars of iron, crossed at right angles and resembling in some measure an ancient portcullis. He went over it carefully with his numbed fingers, and found that the horizontal and transverse bars were firmly riveted together. He also discovered that it had hinges on one side, and that on the other side it was fastened to the rock by a massive chain secured with a padlock. It was, in short, a gate, and its presence seemed to imply that the passage was used as a means of egress and ingress, and that for some reason or other the people who used it were anxious to make their underground residence into a fortress. He realised now that he had found Jordison's hiding place, but he could not as yet see how this exit could be of any possible use to a motor car. 50 yards away from him an arch of grey showed against the blackness of the tunnel. A single star twinkled beneath the roof and the water, and far off he could see the moving lights of a ship. He resolved to wait till daylight. And, as he waited, he realised Jordison's cruelty to the full. The man had purposefully left him unfettered in the darkness so that he could make this effort to escape and find, after all his sufferings and exertions, this last impregnable barrier between him and liberty. In half an hour's time he could touch the bottom and stand with his head above water. His naked and shivering body was now almost lifeless with the cold, and he set to work to warm himself. At first he splashed and kicked vigorously in the water. Then, as the tide receded still further, he swung his arms to and fro across his chest as cabmen do on a wintry day in London, and danced up and down on the sandy bottom. He knew that he must keep moving, and although he was almost exhausted with hunger and thirst and fatigue, he never rested for a minute in his exertions to keep the blood circulating in his half-frozen body. At last the tide ran out from the tunnel, and the arch of sky began to fade into a lighter shade of grey. Then a faint tinge of yellow appeared at the base of it, rising and rising till it became an arch of gold. Then the burning rim of the sun appeared, and a few minutes later the glory of it poured into the narrow tunnel and turned the dark walls into a splendour of wet and sparkling rock, blazing with a myriad points of light. At that moment, Home realised that the sun worshippers had a very solid truth at the root of their superstitious reverence. The rising sun, seen large through the morning mists and almost filling the mouth of the tunnel with its glowing sphere, seemed indeed a thing to be worshipped and adored. It was, however, no time for regarding the dawn in any spirit of sentiment. Home first turned his attention to the great iron gate now standing out firm and definite against the light. He examined it quickly and carefully, his eyes searching keenly for some weak spot in chain or bar. But it was as strong as the gate of a medieval castle. The bars had apparently been fastened together with their steel screws, and the heads of the screws had been cut off. He shook the gate with all his strength till his whole body glowed with the exertion. The chain that secured it to the wall gave 2 or 3 inches each way, and the tunnel resounded in the clash and rattle of the steel links. But Holmes saw at a glance that it would be almost impossible to loosen or break anything. The chain would have held a 100-ton boat for her moorings. The padlock was enormous, of solid steel, and fitted with a patent lock. The staples and the hinges were cemented into the rock on either side, and were as firm as the rock itself. Then his eyes travelled to the top of the gate. It had been impossible to run it quite flush with the uneven surface of the rock, but at no part was there a gap of more than 6 inches in depth. The bottom of the framework was covered with ½ an inch of sand. Holmes sunk on his knees and scraped a hole under the lowest bar. At the depth of about 4 inches he came down to the solid rock. He rose to his feet and realised that it was impossible for him to break through the gate unless he could obtain help from the other side. He stared at the broad expanse of gold across the sea and tried to find out whereabouts he was on the coast. He knew that he was looking almost due east, for he had seen the sun rise. 8 or 9 miles away on the horizon, 2 ships, one a brig and the other small steamer, were moving northward. There was no land in sight, and his keen eyes, trained to observe details that escaped the eye of a landsman, could not detect a single boat on the whole expanse of smooth waters. But he noticed that the tide was running out with incredible swiftness, and that already the sea was nearly 1/4 of a mile from the mouth of the tunnel, while even farther out bare ridges and islands of sand were rising from the surrounding water. Home ransacked his memory for some clue to the locality of the scene. He was thoroughly acquainted with the coast, as viewed from the deck of a boat, and the turns and depths of every creek and channel were completely charted out in his mind. But he guessed that these shallow flats lay far inside safe water, even for so small a vessel as the Rover, and that probably he had passed no nearer to them than the vessels he saw on the horizon. He knew, however, that he looked east, and that traffic went north and south. It was also quite clear that his back was to the land, and that he was, therefore, on the east coast. Then he suddenly realised where he was, and cursed himself for a fool for not having grasped the fact before. The rock that surrounded him afforded the clue. Rock was scarce on that coast of marshland and sandbanks, but a few pieces of it were scattered about in one particular district, mere islands of stone that some great upheaval had thrust up from the earth and sand around them. The red house had been built on one of these, and all the others were within a radius of 10 miles. This was probably one of the triplets, 3 small patches of firm land, 1/4 of a mile from a large tract of marsh, and set right on the edge of the great East Ray Flats. His heart sank within him as he realised his position. No big vessels ever crossed these shallow and dangerous waters, and no fishermen ever set their nets or lines on the barren ground. At low tide no man ever put foot on the sands, for between the island and the shore lay a line of quicksands broad and deep enough to have engulfed an army corpse. He shuddered, and turning away from the sand, retraced his steps up the tunnel to find his clothes and cover his shivering body. As he receded from the entrance, the day passed into twilight, and his own dark shadow blended more and more with the surrounding greyness. When at last he came to the place where he had left his clothes, he found to his surprise that they had vanished. The shilling still lay on the rock where he had placed and forgotten it. He moved a few yards further up the passage, searching every inch of the ground for some trace of his garments. Then suddenly a long white object shimmered before him in the half light. He stooped down and touched some soft material. Then he grasped it and drew it up to him foot by foot. It was a large white sheet, thick and warm to the touch. Underneath it lay a long black box. He kicked it with his foot and it rang out hollow. Then he examined it closely and gave a cry of horror as he realized the shape of it. It was a roughly made coffin, and the square piece of material which he held in his hands was doubtless intended as a winding sheet. Then he burst into a peal of laughter. He thought that the keen wits of a sane man ought surely to prevail over the maniac mind that had conceived so gruesome a jest as this. End of chapter 26. Recording by Drew Conway, Kent. Chapter 27 of The Black Motor Car. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Drew Conway. The Black Motor Car by BURLAND. Chapter 27. Jordison's Retreat. Home wrapped the thick sheet twice round him, so that the edge of it hung clear from the ground, and rent 2 holes in it through which he passed his bare arms. It was a ridiculous and insufficient covering, but it was warm and grateful to a man whose shivering body had been exposed for hours to the cold air and water. Its chief failing as a garment was its insecurity. This could have been remedied by 6 safety pins, but as these were not forthcoming, the wearer had to hold the folds round his body with one hand. Thus attired, in a costume which would have been ludicrous under more pleasing circumstances, Holmes set out to explore the tunnel in the other direction, and see whether the opposite end was as completely guarded as that which ran into the sea. He had but small hopes for the result of his investigation. Jordison's plans for his death were quite clear to him, and the knowledge was accentuated by the sorry jest of the coffin and the winding sheet. He was evidently destined to perish slowly of thirst and cold and starvation in a tunnel of rock securely sealed at either end. But the young man's spirits, which had been almost extinguished by the cold water and the final barrier that had crossed his road to freedom, were rekindled by the comparative warmth of his covering. The first shock of the coffin and the shroud had been horrible, dealt as it had been in the semi-darkness and loneliness of the tunnel, and it had certainly been conceived and carried out with the sole object of frightening the unfortunate prisoner. But Jordison had underestimated the strength of Holmes' mind, and was ignorant of its keen sense of humour, a sense that could extract a certain grim amusement from the most dismal circumstances. It was undoubtedly this sense of the ridiculous that saved the young man's mind from breaking down at this critical moment. Where others might have only seen the horror of the winding sheet, he could not help wondering how he looked in these strange garments. and the possible grotesqueness of his appearance appealed to his risible faculties. As to the coffin, he was already turning over in his mind how he could make use of it to his own advantage. The real horror of the situation lay in the pangs of thirst and hunger which were now furiously attacking his exhausted frame. There were at present no means of combating these ferocious adversaries, and no strength of mind could meet them with any chance of success. Home could fight with fear, but not with his own physical necessities. However, he tried to thrust aside all thoughts of his sufferings and moved swiftly away from the sea, keeping one hand on the rocky wall beside him. As he proceeded into the recesses of the tunnel, the twilight died away into darkness, and a last faint patch of light, seen far off like the gleam of a star, was finally hidden round a bend in the passage. He counted his steps carefully as he walked, and tried to make every pace a yard in length. He could not afford to neglect the smallest and least likely source of information. When he traversed about 3 miles, as near as he could judge, his bare foot struck something hard, and there was a clink on the stone floor. He stooped down and groped about in the darkness till his hand encountered a small jug. He had overturned it, and the rock was wet with some liquid. He dabbed his fingers on the damp stone and raised it to his mouth. Then he flung himself down and licked every inch of the rock. The jug had been filled with fresh water. A spoonful of it had collected in a small crevice, and he tore his tongue in his efforts to extract it. This was doubtless another of Jordison's pleasantries. 100 yards further on, he stepped on some round objects that gave and cracked beneath his foot. He stooped down again and thrust his fingers into a sticky mass, full of sharp, thin flakes. He tasted it and smacked his lips. He had crushed 2 or 3 eggs into a pulp. Feeling carefully round him in the darkness, he came across a whole one. He broke off the top and swallowed the contents. It was a strong flavoured egg, probably that of a wild duck, and not too fresh, but it seemed very good to the starving man. When he had drained it to the last drop and sucked the broken pieces of the shell, he scooped up all he could get from the floor and enjoyed even that. It was no time for nice feeding. Of a truth, this Jordison was a merry fellow and full of devices. This scanty meal and the few drops of water he had managed to gather from the rocky floor put fresh life into his body, and he moved forward more rapidly. But it seemed as if the tunnel would never cease, and it was not till he had walked steadily for another hour and a half that he saw the first sign of some termination to his journey. All at once the veil of darkness was pierced by a pinhole of light, a mere speck, so minute that Home at first thought it merely a creation of his own brain. One of those points of light that cross a man's eye in the darkness. But this one did not move, and the steadiness of it proclaimed its reality. He did not dare hope that it was daylight, but at least the glimmer of it offered some relief from the darkness. As he walked on, it grew larger and larger, and then became definite in shape, a small square of yellow, like the light of a lamp seen through a tiny window. Then there came to his ears the distant murmur of voices, and then to his nostrils the glorious smell of hot meat wafted toward him like a breath of life, sweet, luscious, alluring beyond any temptation devised by Satan in this world. He crept nearer and nearer to the light, moving cautiously as not to attract the attention of the speakers. The conversation grew more and more distinct, and soon he recognized Jordison's voice. At last he came to the end of his journey, and his fingers traced out a massive doorway of wood, barred and clamped with iron. 10 feet to his right, and on a level with his chin, there was a hole about 9 inches square, and a long shaft of yellow light streamed out from it into the darkness of the tunnel. Holmes sidled quietly along the door till he reached the aperture. Then he peered cautiously around the edge of it, well aware that he was bound to be seen if anyone inside happened to be looking in that direction. But, as luck would have it, the only 2 occupants of the vast cavern that opened out before his astonished eyes were sitting with their backs to the door. The place that William Jordison had chosen for his subterranean house was, indeed, princely in its proportions. It was lit with a dozen oil lamps, yet these did not more than make the darkness visible. The roof was hidden in a cloud of impenetrable gloom. Deep shadows lay on distant parts of the floor. The voices of the 2 men reverberated from wall to wall of the apartment, and gave some idea of its enormous size. The furniture that Jordison had brought down with him from his residence above ground looked as though it had been taken from a doll's house. The carpets, 18 and 20 feet square, spread here and there over the floor, looked like little hearth rugs. The 2 men sitting before a large fire of crackling logs were no bigger than the forest pygmies of Central Africa. And over everything hung a gauzy veil of smoke that magnified heights and distances and lent an air of mystery to the most commonplace objects. Over the fire hung a great steaming kettle, and to Holmes' sensitive nostrils the whole place smelt like a kitchen. He saw at a glance that the 2 men were Lip and Jordison. Scraps of their conversation came to his ears, and only the echo of the cavern prevented him from hearing every word they uttered. "He'd ought to be fast this time. I reckon he's cold. May his soul and body rot, that coffin. It makes me laugh. We fair busted the old machine. He'll speak now, I guess, eh? Dead? Not much. He'll take a lot of killing. Oh? Yes, she's safe enough. Reckon he ought to be turning up soon, Law. How I shall laugh, governor." And so on, and so on. Holmes listened in silence with parted lips. His whole body trembled with excitement. The callous cynicism of Jordison and the rough brutality of his servant left no impression on his mind that had been hardened by more material evils than coarse language. But he had caught a few sentences bearing unmistakable reference to Lady Agnes Cliff, and he gathered that she was still alive and confined, like himself, in the recesses of these subterranean caves and passages. The knowledge filled him with a 2-fold responsibility. His own life was doubly precious, and he resolved to guard it carefully. For on it depended the safety and freedom of one for whom he would have gladly laid it down if it had been so required. He hesitated whether to reveal his presence or lie hiding till the men had disappeared and he could make some effort to break through the door. He had as yet formulated no clear plan of escape, even if he succeeded in gaining an entrance into the cavern. The presence of Lady Agnes would make matters doubly difficult, for she, at any rate, had to be saved, even if he lost his own life in the attempt. The question was decided for him. Lip made some coarse jest about Lady Agnes, and every word came clear to the listener's ears. Jordison laughed and replied in the same strain. In an instant Holmes' blood boiled with fury, the yellow light became a mist of blood, and he flung all caution to the winds. Thrusting one bare arm and clenched fist through the opening, he yelled out the single word, Liar! And the sound of it echoed and reverberated through the cavern like the shriek of winds. Lip and Jordison both sprang to their feet and turned towards him. Then, seeing the bare muscular arm extended towards them, they both laughed and came over to the door. "Ain't he heavenly?" said Lip with a broad grin. "Not yet," replied Jordison with a quiet sneer, "but he will be presently. At least, we hope so, if he has lived a virtuous life. Good morning, Mr. Home. I trust you had a pleasant night?" Home did not answer, but drew back his arm and glared through the tiny opening of the door. He read his fate in the two faces that grinned back at him, the one bestial and repulsive, the other keen, gaunt and wild, with the light of madness glinting in the dark eyes. Jordison advanced and struck him in the face with his fingers. "Get back, you dog!" he cried savagely. Home reeled back, smarting under the blow. But he had made up his mind to be calm and conciliatory for the sake of the life that was so dear to him. "Give me food and water," he cried, "for pity's sake." "Oh, that's your song, is it?" Jordison replied. "It's a tune we shall have to get accustomed to, eh, Lip? But you won't be too hard on him the first day, eh, Lip? Is the dinner ready?" The servant went back to the steaming pot, and fishing out a piece of meat, thrust it into his mouth. "It's good," he cried. "Lay the table over there," Jordison called back. "We don't want to seem unsociable, and tell Lady Agnes that breakfast is ready." Lip brought forward a small square table, set it down within a yard of the door, and proceeded to lay it carefully. Then he crossed the cavern and disappeared. In 2 minutes' time he returned, and Lady Agnes Cliff walked by his side. Her face was very white, and the dark rings under her eyes spoke of long hours of suffering and sleepless nights. As she came into view, Home cast one fierce, hungry look at her and withdrew his face from the opening. Jordison and Lady Agnes took their seats at the table, and Lip brought forward the hot stew from the fire and placed portions of it on their plates. He did not sit down himself, but he took a large allowance of the food to a distant corner of the cavern. During the meal, Home crouched silently against the door. He listened to the clink of knives and forks, and the hot scent of the meat was agony to the starving man. Jordison endeavoured to lend point to the situation by praising the victuals and making eulogistic remarks about the wine. At the end of the meal he raised his glass to his lips. "A toast," he cried suddenly. "Long life to Mr. Arthur Home." Lady Agnes Cliff flushed, but for all that she raised her own glass to her lips and breathed a silent prayer, and it was at that moment that she caught sight of Home's face at the window. He had decided to reveal himself in case she might be able to release him from his prison. She gave a cry of horror and started to her feet. Jordison laughed merrily. "Why, there is Mr. Home," he said in a mocking voice. "How well he looks, seeing that he has not had anything to eat or drink for 2 days. I wish we could have asked him to join us, but it is, I'm afraid, impossible. Long life to Mr. Arthur Home." Then a tender and delicately nurtured girl did a strange thing. She leant over the table and struck Jordison a blow in the face with all her strength. Before he could recover from his surprise, she had plunged her head into the hot mass of meat and thrust a few fragments of it through the hole in the door. Then she seized the half bottle of wine, but Jordison caught her wrist and pulled her back on the table with a crash. "How pretty," he said with a sneer. "I am afraid, Lady Agnes, I must ask Lip to conduct you back to your apartment." Mr. Home is starving, and so much meat is not good for a starving man." "You lie," yelled Home. "I am as well fed as you, and I could not drink any more if I wanted to." Then he wrenched at the door and beat against the panels with his bare fists till the whole woodwork shook and rattled and the cavern resounded with the noise of his blows. Lip came from his corner and led Lady Agnes away without any ceremony, and Home and Jordison were alone. The latter came close to the door and, lighting a cigar, smiled at the white face at the window. "Well, Mr. Home, I think you are fast this time." "Where's Lord Harry Quay?" Home asked abruptly. "You will join him presently," answered Jordison with a grim smile, and then Home knew the Lord Harry Quay was dead. End of chapter 27. Recording by Drew Conway, Kent.
Chapter 28 of The Black Motor Car. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Painter. The Black Motor Car by Harris BURLAND. Chapter 28. Jordison learns the truth at last. All through that day Home crouched against the massive door and waited to lay hold of such opportunities as chance might be pleased to throw to him. But hour after hour passed, and not a single ray of light broke in upon his mental darkness. His fingers went over the door 100 times, until the position of every nail and screw and clamp was photographed clearly in his mind. He measured the thickness of the wood at the opening, and found that the door was made of 2½ inches of solid timber. He tried to ascertain how it was secured, but all the bolts and fastenings were on the other side. He only gathered one thing, however, from his investigations, namely, that it would be impossible to break it open without tools of some sort. A file, a chisel, a knife, even a steel nail, or a bit of broken pottery, would have given him a minute chance of success. Hours of patient and undisturbed work with an instrument of this sort would perhaps have enabled him to loosen the hinges in the wall or cut through the planks by the bolts, but he had nothing save his bare fingers, and the task was hopeless. He saw nothing more of Lady Agnes Cliff. She represented his only hope of escape, and it was quite certain that the two men would not allow her the smallest opportunity of giving him any assistance. She was doubtless securely confined in some other part of the cavern. The thought of her in some measure turned Holmes's mind from his own personal suffering, but only by the painful process of substituting mental for physical agony. Perhaps she too was destined to die. Perhaps a worse fate was in store for her. He shuddered to think what a delicate-minded girl like Lady Agnes Cliff might suffer at the hands of two such brutal ruffians as Lip and Jordison. The two men were in the cavern most of the day, but neither of them came near him, and they removed their table to the fireside, where they conversed in whispers. Holm watched them feed with hungry eyes, and the smell of their food nearly drove the starving man to madness. They paid no attention to him as he peered through the little hole. They seemed to have forgotten his existence. The young man fully expected a further cross-examination by Jordison, and a promise of release in return for the information Jordison desired. He had already made up his mind to give way on this, if his submission would ensure the safety of the woman he loved. But Jordison did not give him the chance, and as he had decided that his confession should only be a last resource, he held his peace. Shortly after midday, as far as he could judge in a place where it was always night, he heard Lip and Jordison busy tinkering with something against the wall in which the door was set. but he could not see what they were doing. An hour later a great black body slid out into the centre of the hall, and for the first time Home had a clear and uninterrupted view of the famous black car. Something had been wrong with it on the night of the chase, and it was evident that Jordison was putting it in thorough order. He drove it several times around the cavern, steering with wonderful skill and accuracy. Then he came to a stop and discussed its merits with Lip. What struck Home most forcibly about the business was the utter contempt with which they treated him. They were not afraid to reveal their secrets to him. They talked loudly about the car, and Jordison laid bare almost all the secrets of its construction. He further disclosed how they had made use of the passage leading to the great East Ray quicksands, spoke of how they had spent 2 months in making a hard way over them to the shore, where a small lane ran down to the edge of the sands, told how they had filled up the quaking surface of the ground with rock taken from the mouth of the tunnel, and how this hard way, covered by the tide with sand, had escaped the notice of the searchers. As they conversed, Home realized they were talking for his benefit. It was quite clear they did not wish to conceal anything from him, equally clear that he did not count, that he was already regarded as a dead man. When they had finished their conversation, the 2 men crossed the cavern and disappeared. Toward evening Jordison came to the door and threw 2 small crusts of bread through the aperture. Home gnawed them like a wild beast, though he knew that they were intended only to prolong the agony of starvation. An hour later all the lights were extinguished in the cavern, and only the red embers of the fire glowed in the darkness. At last these died out, and Home realized how much the light meant to him. He even missed the presence of his enemies, the sound of a human voice, and the sight of a human form. Anything was better than the silence and the loneliness and the gloom of the subterranean world. Thoroughly exhausted in body and mind, he slept for a few hours, and awoke once more in darkness. He had been dreaming of the sunlight and the sea and the white foam before the bows of the Rover. The blackness suffocated him, and he longed for a breath of fresh air and a glimpse of daylight. He rose to his feet and made his way once more down the tunnel till he reached the water's edge. The tide was still between the bars of the gate. There he waited till the day broke and the sun streamed in upon him. He walked back into the tunnel and began to break the coffin into pieces. He tore off the boards one by one and broke each of them in half under his foot. Then, searching in the sand, he found an oyster shell, and with this rude pen he scratched a message on each piece of wood. "Come to triplets at once. 2 lives in danger. Arthur Home." Then he cast them as far as he could into the water, and prayed that at least one of them might float ashore into human hands. This done, he returned slowly through all the weary length of the tunnel, and crouched once more against the door which separated him from the cavern. Another day passed, and still he caught no glimpse of Lady Agnes Cliff, and still neither of the men paid any attention to him. Once or twice he called out to them, but they did not even turn their heads. Toward nightfall Jordison again passed 2 small crusts of bread through the window. Home found that a small tin half full of water had been placed inside the door. That night he again went down to the other end, and all through the day, so long as the tide was out, he sat close to the iron bars and looked across the sea, waiting in vain for some boat to appear on the lonely waters. When he returned to the cavern end, he found his clothes and boots lying in a heap against the door. He put them on, and felt more like a man. He also found the daily crusts of bread, and another wine-glassful of water in a tin. And so he dragged out a terrible existence for 4 days, and then all at once his senses left him, and he collapsed into a crumpled heap on the rocky floor. Before Jordison retired to rest that night, he sat alone before the dying embers of the fire, with his elbows on his knees and his gaunt face between his hands. His eyes glittered strangely, and his head, thrust out of the shadow of the cavern, and illuminated by the red light, seemed like that of some lost soul emerging from the outer darkness into the fires of hell. And there, in the red glow of the logs, he saw the record of his own life. First, the bright flames of youth and ambition, then the roaring furnace of love and shame and degradation, then the steady heat of undying revenge, lit with a white-hot flame, and now the flickering of fires that had been nearly burnt out, and the red-hot ashes that would soon be cold and grey. The whole history of his life passed before his eyes, and in the darkness of his subterranean refuge he could not find any distraction from the memories of the past. During the last few months the danger and excitement of existence had allowed him but little time to think. His mind, unhinged by suffering and resentment of the wrongs he had endured, had found relief in wild excess and the pursuit of an inexorable revenge. His revenge was nearly complete. He had found Marie de la Mothe, and he had found Arthur Sterius, the man who had killed his son. The latter was suffering the agonies of a living death within a few yards of him. The former was always within his reach, dragging out a horrible existence, with the fear of him ever at her heart, only waiting for him to strike the final blow. Lord Overcliffe was dead, and even Lady Agnes Cliffe had not escaped him. He had resolved that she too should die, and that Lord Heatherstone should be the last victim. His scheme of revenge had included both the innocent and the guilty. He had decided that the whole of the cursed house that had allied themselves to Marie de la Mothe should share in her destruction. Yet on this night, as he watched the red-hot wood and listened to the tiny cracks and clicks that came from it, his mind seemed to have sunk into a deep gloom, and the fury that had given strength of purpose to his life had ebbed, and left his thoughts on a darkened shore, haunted with ghosts of bygone years. His struggles as an ambitious young bank clerk, the days of his courtship and his marriage, the prattling voice of his son, the temptation and the downfall, his dead wife, the hell of the convict prison, the busy days in France, when he reconstructed a fortune from nothing, the search for the woman who had wronged him, and the son whom he loved, the loss of his money, the resolve to obtain more at any cost, the first robbery, ending in murder, the news of his son's death, a felon slain by a fellow criminal, the discovery of the man who had killed him, the discovery of Marie de la Mothe, the whole long record rolled out year after year before him, the various figures flitted past and mocked him, the voices of the dead whispered in his ears. He was presented with a complete biography of his life, written, not in words, but in scenes and pictures, scarcely less real than the incidents themselves. The dying embers of the fire sank to a black heap of charred wood and ashes, marked with streaks and splashes of dull red. The cavern closed in upon the motionless figure, and the faint glow scarcely showed his face in relief against the encroaching wall of blackness. The silence was complete and unbroken, save for the ghostly little noises that came now and then from the glowing wood. Then suddenly there came a piercing cry of terror, and the rocky wall echoed it and tossed it from side to side, till it swelled into a long shriek of pain. Jordison started to his feet, and stared round at the darkness with wide open eyes. For a moment a cold fear gripped his heart. Then he laughed, and striking a match, lit one of the oil lamps. The light disclosed nothing, but as he listened he heard a faint mumbling and muttering in the distance. He smiled grimly. He realized that his victim was delirious. Anxious to gain some information from his ravings, he crossed over to the great wooden door and stood close to the opening. "West, still west," muttered the voice. "Haul in that main sheet a bit, the wind's shifting. What in God's name is all that whisky for? Australia, eh? No, I won't consent. I will take her back to Valparaiso. A revolver, eh? Well, it's a good argument." Then there was silence, and then low muttered sentences that Jordison could not catch, though he strained every nerve to grasp their meaning. Then suddenly he heard a scuffle, and an arm shot out through the opening, and thin white fingers clutched the air. He seized the wrist and thrust it back, and he heard the heavy fall of a body on the rock. Then there was again silence, and then the voice began again to speak. £200,000, he cried out. "You scoundrel! A fair chance for life, eh? You devil! You missed that time? Ah! We're on equal terms now. A truce, eh? No? Well, take that, and that, and that! My God! I've killed him! For heaven's sake, speak, Arthur! Speak, Steerius!" And the voice once more died away in an inaudible whisper. Jordison leaned against the door, and a cold sweat broke out on his body. The dying man had called out to Arthur Steerius, and yet "Dickie's tired," the voice went on. "And where's mother? Gone away on a visit? What do these two ugly men want? What do the fowls say, papa? Cluck, 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 and a cockle-doodle-doo. Ah, what a splash the body made! Good-bye, Steerius. You brought it on yourself, you know. Cluck, 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 and quack, quack. Oh, my God! Water! Water!" And the voice rose in a shriek of agony. But before it had died away, Jordison was tearing back the bolts and fumbling with the lock. Then he flung the massive door back with a crash, and fetching the lamp, leaned over the form of the dying man and peered closely into his face. A few moments later he had borne him into the cavern and was pouring brandy and water down his throat, and Lip, hastily summoned from his sleep, was rekindling the fire and preparing some soup. For Jordison had at last come to the full knowledge of the awful truth, and knew that this was Richard Behag, and that he had been torturing his own son to death. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of The Black Motor Car. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Painter. The Black Motor Car by Harris BURLAND. Chapter 29. The Mystery of the Pajarito. "His life must be saved at any cost," said Jordison, as they tried to revive the exhausted man. "I have made a mistake, a terrible mistake. Why the hell doesn't that fire burn up? Pour some oil on it." And all through that night the two men laboured with food and hot water and brandy and warm blankets. Lip, understanding nothing of what was going on, cursed incessantly, but a glance at his master's grim and terrible face told him that he must labour till their task was accomplished. At 6 o'clock in the morning Arthur Holmes slept, and the light of life had crept once more into his ashen face. 12 hours later he woke into consciousness. His wrists and ankles were lightly chained by pieces of rope, for Jordison knew that if ever he was to arrive at the truth, and conceal his own secret, he would have to play his part up to the end. In spite of his bonds, Home felt warm and comfortable, and shortly after he woke, Jordison fed him with some thick and steaming soup. The young man took it without a word. When he had finished, he looked at Jordison with questioning eyes. "Yes," said Jordison sternly, "you've guessed right. I want some information out of you, and dead men cannot speak. That soup is good, isn't it? Well, there's lots more of it. But you go back to the tunnel if you don't speak this time, and stay there till you rot. Do you understand?" Home nodded. "If you tell me the truth," Jordison continued, "I'll be merciful. I'll shoot you and spare you much suffering, and I'll let Lady Agnes go free. Lip, you may go." The servant left the cavern. Home pondered the matter for a minute, and then smiled. If he had to die, it was better to die in comfort than face the slow starvation and darkness of the tunnel. Besides, Lady Agnes's life would be saved, and the certainty of that was worth all that he could give, even the minute chance of his own escape. "I'll speak," he said curtly. "I will tell you who I am." "You said you were a friend of my father." "I am Arthur Sterius, and I killed Richard Behag." Jordison rose to his feet. "You lie!" he cried. "I know well enough who you are. You are Richard Behag, and you killed Arthur Sterius." Home made no reply to Jordison's words. They had been flung at him as a thunderbolt is flung from the skies. The noise and crash of them were still in his ears. He was too stunned to make any answer. "Yes," Jordison continued sternly, "you are Richard Behag, and it was the body of Arthur Sterius that was found on the shores north of Valparaiso. He was murdered." Still Home did not speak. He clenched his bound hands and bowed his head. Jordison took out his watch and looked at it. "In half an hour's time," he said quietly, "you will be a dead man. But if you will tell me the truth, and all the truth, I will release Lady Agnes Cliff. If you refuse to speak, she shall die too. I will give you 2 minutes to decide." "Why do you want to know?" Home replied, still not looking up from the ground. "Of what interest is it to you? Who are you? And how does the death of either Behag or Sterius concern you?" "It does not matter who I am," Jordison replied. "I have made you an offer, and you can take it or leave it. You have but a short time to consider the matter, and I should advise you not to waste it in conversation." Jordison spoke calmly, but every nerve and fibre of his being tingled with excitement. He was playing a gigantic game of bluff. Whatever reply came from Holmes's lips, the lives of both Home and Lady Agnes Cliff were safe. Jordison could not kill his own son, or the woman that his son loved. But the wretched man yearned for some word that would free his son from the cloud that hung over his head, the murder of a companion, the robbery of a firm that had placed their trust in him. If he held out the hope of life, it was possible that Home would not speak the truth. But a man on the verge of death will not lie when he knows that no words can save his life. If only Jordison could have revealed himself, it would have been easy to arrive at the truth. But the man, for all his vileness, had one clear idea of honour in his mind, that the son must never know the terrible history of the father's life. He sat silent, with the watch in his hand. "The 2 minutes are up," he said at last. If Home had only looked at his face, he might have read the truth. He might have seen that the man was waiting anxiously, not for a confession of crime, but for a proof of innocence. But Home did not look up from the ground. However, the bribe was too great. Lady Agnes's life had to be saved at any cost. Jordison's bluff came off successfully. "I will tell you all," the young man said, "but first you must swear by all you hold sacred, if indeed you hold anything sacred in heaven or earth, that Lady Agnes Cliff shall return unmolested to her home." "I swear this to you," Jordison said earnestly. Home looked him in the face and saw that the man was speaking the truth. "When I reached Valparaiso," he began, but Jordison interrupted him. "I should like you to start your story before that date. Why did you leave England?" Home paused for a moment. "Surely you don't want to know that," he said after a while. "I do," Jordison answered. "I knew your father and mother and you too as a little child. They were good folk. Why did you run away from them?" He had a horrible fear that this part of the young man's story might disclose some fresh disgrace, some new evidence of the criminal instinct that had descended from father to son. His researches had failed to discover anything of the sort, but there are many sins which never come to light. "Well," Home replied, after another pause, "if you insist, I must tell you. But I cannot think of it without shame now that my father and mother are both dead." Again he stopped, and a look of pain crossed his face. "Go on," Jordison said sternly. "Look on me as your confessor. My lips are sealed." Home shuddered. The reference to confession brought the idea of death very close to him. "It is a simple story," he said hoarsely, "and a commonplace story. I was young, headstrong, and passionately fond of the sea. My parents, may God rest their souls, thought the life unfitted for a lad of promise and intellect. My father, whose whole heart was in his work, thought that my life should be given to the propagation of Christianity in foreign parts. My heart did not fail me at the thought of the work. In fact, its dangers provided the only bright spot in the life it offered. But, well, they say the sons of clergymen are often inclined to be irreligious. I understand it now. The perpetual air of piety was galling to me. I felt like the girl behind the counter of the sweet shop, who could not bear the taste of a single chocolate or caramel. The life had begun to stifle me. The air of the vicarage seemed close, narrow, and stuffy. The good side of it became more and more obscured. The disadvantages became more and more apparent. I was overwhelmed with the sanctity of it all. I longed to be free, to mingle with rough worldly folk, to say whatever I pleased, to do whatever I pleased. I was, of course, entirely in the wrong, but perhaps you can understand?" "I understand," Jordison replied. "Well, one morning I disappeared with a few pounds in my pocket, the result of years of enforced thrift, set aside in a money box, and concealed myself in the labyrinth of London. I got a job on a small merchant vessel and—" "That'll do," Jordison broke in. "Go on to Valparaiso." His heart yearned for every detail of his son's life, but he was impatient for the main central fact, the death of Arthur Sterius. One load had already been lifted from his mind. The boy had not left home to escape from the consequences of any disgraceful action. It was possible that the death of Arthur Sterius might yet be explained. Jordison could not wait for details. "That was 2 years afterward," said Home. "My 6th voyage. How much do you know?" Jordison told him briefly what the inquiry agent had disclosed. "Well," said Home, "I will now tell you the truth. It would not save my neck in the dock, but it is the truth for all that. I have no reason to tell you a lie. I am not a criminal lying for his life." "I shall believe you," Jordison said hurriedly. "Go on with the story." "Well," Holmes said, "one Sunday morning Arthur Sterius and I went out for a sail in his boat, the Pajarito." "The robbery first!" cried Jordison. "Tell me of that. I know nothing of that." Home looked up at him in surprise, and laughed bitterly. "Your interruption is excusable," he said slowly, but I knew nothing of the robbery until after I was on the boat. Please let me tell my story in my own way." Jordison mumbled an apology. His heart was too full for words. He could have risen and clasped his son in his arms, but he only turned away his face, lest the young man should see the joy that flared up in his eyes. "Well," Home continued, "as I was saying, one Sunday morning we went out for a sail in the Pajarito. We usually spent our Sundays on the water, sometimes in the large boat, but more often in the small one. Occasionally we did not return till daybreak on Monday morning. The boat contained 2 small but convenient berths, and a supply of water, biscuits, and tinned meat was always kept on board. A yachtsman has to be prepared for emergencies. The mere dropping of the wind may—" "Yes, yes," Jordison interrupted impatiently, "but go on with your story." "I mentioned the food," Home continued with a slight frown, "because it was through a casual inspection of our supplies that my suspicion of Sterius was first aroused. We were at the time some 20 miles out of Valparaiso, running before a fair breeze off the land. Sterius was at the tiller, and I went down into our little box of a cabin to get a drink of water. You can imagine my surprise on opening the locker, where we kept our jar, to find a dozen bottles of whiskey lying up against it. I opened the other lockers, and found them crammed with food of every description. I also found 4 more large jars of water in the fore cabin. I went up on deck and questioned Sterius. I think I asked him in jest if we were bound for Australia. He kept his eye on the burgee at our masthead, and replied that if I distracted his attention with silly questions, he would certainly jibe the boat. I said nothing for a few minutes, but I lay on the deck and glanced at his face from time to time, and noticed a curious look on it. He kept his eyes fixed on the little fluttering flag, as though all his wits were needed to steer by it. But I knew that this excessive care was quite unnecessary, and as I puffed thoughtfully at my pipe, I turned the matter over in my mind, and, to say the truth, began to be a little uneasy about it. I offered to take the tiller, but he curtly refused, and still kept the boat's head into the west. After a time I repeated my question, and he looked at me thoughtfully, as though trying to gauge my interest in the matter. Then he made a clean breast of the whole affair. He spoke hastily, as though half ashamed of his words, but yet with an air of dogged determination that argued ill for any opposition on my part. He explained that he had stolen the keys of the safe, one from me and one from his father, and that he had on board at that minute £5,000 in cash and £195,000 worth of negotiable securities. He went on to say that he would have taken me earlier into his confidence, but that he had some doubts of my loyalty. I think that was the word he used. I thanked him in my heart for these doubts, and I saw at once the true reason of his friendship. I was at the time sorry, for I had a real liking for Sterius, in spite of all his vices. I did not then know to what depths a desperate man can sink, though I knew a few hours afterward. He went on to say that we were provisioned for a month, and that our destination was Iquique. He laboriously explained, as though defending himself, that he had chosen this means of escape for good reasons. He intended that the Pajarito should never be seen again, and that we should both be accounted dead men. He concluded by generously offering to go halves with me if I would assist him in his scheme. I will do the man justice on this point. He could have made away with me and ensured my silence effectually, but it was not till I had driven him into a corner that he attempted my life. He rounded off the effectiveness of his speech by casually producing a revolver and slipping it back into his pocket again. I was 10 feet from him at the time, or I would have tried to take it from him before we started the discussion on the matter. I replied, as I think most men of my stamp would have done, I thanked him sarcastically for considering me in the matter. I reviled him in language that only a sailor could have conceived. I expostulated with him, and tried to work on his better feelings as a gentleman and the son of an honourable man. I pointed out to him the ruin he would bring on his father's firm. I exhausted every means in my power, but he was hard as steel, and I could not even scratch the surface of his mind. I concluded by stating emphatically that I meant to bring the Pajarito into Valparaiso that night and save him from the consequences of his folly. We thrashed the matter out for 2 hours, and he backed up his arguments with his pistol. I shall not forget those hours as long as I live. I can still see the blue, glorious sky, the dancing waves, the white swelling sails, the man at the stern, one hand on the tiller and one on his revolver, and above all the deepening lines of evil on the handsome face. In the end we compromised. He agreed to let me drop out of the business. He said he would put me ashore at a small village 50 miles north of Valparaiso, a place outside all railways and telegraph wires, and that he would go through the affair by himself. I swore to use no force to turn him from his purpose, and we resumed our relations as fellow yachtsmen on a boat that required the attention of both of us. After lunch I felt drowsy and fell asleep. When I woke I was lying on the deck with my face to the sky, and I was bound hand and foot. Steerius was at the tiller, and I noticed with surprise that he had my clothes on. I saw my ring on his finger, and a gold Mexican coin which had been given me by one of the men on the Valletta dangled from my watch chain on my waistcoat. I glanced at my own body. He had transferred all his own things to me. I was dressed in his clothes, and his rings were on my fingers. I could even feel something strange about my shirt and underclothing. It was evident that he had drugged me and changed every single article of my attire. His motives were unpleasantly clear. So long as I was alive, this mere change of habiliments could be of no value to him, but my body, washed up some weeks hence on the coast, unrecognizable save for the garments, rings, etc., would be an adequate proof of the death of Arthur Steerius. Before I spoke, I carefully examined his face. A great change had come over it during the last few hours. All the evil seemed to have worked up to the surface. It had always been dissolute, but now it had become criminal. I will not detail to you the conversation that ensued, and which lasted for over an hour. Steerius made it quite clear to me that he intended to kill me. He also confessed that he had been too much of a coward to kill me in cold blood while I was unconscious. He suggested that I should have a fight for my life, but explained that it would have to be a fight where I was bound to lose the day, the fight of an unarmed man against one armed with a revolver. I thanked him for his consideration, and accepted the chance in the spirit in which it was offered. He was at least as much of a sportsman as the man who fights a partridge with a double-barrelled gun. He loosed my hands and sprang back to the tiller. I unfastened the rest of the ropes myself and took cover behind the mast. He fired once and splintered the wood by my face. But before he could fire again, the wind suddenly shifted and the boat jibed. He hauled at the main sheet with one hand, but was too late. The boom came flying across, and he had only just time to duck his head. The heavy spar caught his hand and sent the revolver spinning into the water. We were once more on equal terms. I suggested a truce, but he would have none of it, and wrenching out the iron tiller from the rudder, he came at me. As luck would have it, the spare tiller, which was larger than the one in ordinary use and reserved for dirty weather, lay up against the fore coamings. Before he could reach me, I was ready to meet him. Every detail of that fight, which lasted for over 10 minutes, is still vivid in my mind. I will only tell you, however, that in the end I broke through his guard with a terrific blow, and the square end of my tiller crashed into his skull. He died without a sound or a word. At first I resolved to return to Valparaiso and tell the whole story to the authorities. But on second thoughts I saw the inherent improbability of the tale. It would certainly have been believed, as, indeed, your detective gathered from the police, that we had both made off with the securities and quarrelled over the division of the spoil. Moreover, justice in South America and in England are two different things. Sterius was the son of a wealthy man, and I had no doubt his father's position would influence the judge in his decision. To cut a long story short, I sailed the boat northward to within 5 miles of a desolate shore, took the securities from Sterius's pocket and the cash from the locker where he had placed it, and threw the body overboard. I left the clothes, etc., as Sterius himself had arranged them. I had now similar reasons for preserving my secret. I wished the world to think that Richard Behag was dead. That night I scuttled the Pajarito in 50 fathoms of water, and rowed ashore in the dinghy. I subsequently made my way to Iquique, and took the first ship to England. On my arrival I posted all the stolen property to its lawful owners, only keeping back £2,000 for my own use. This was almost the precise amount that I had to my credit in Valparaiso, as the result of a lucky speculation in wheat, and which I knew would be confiscated. It is odd that the police did not seize upon this clue and arrive at the true facts. Of my doings in England, it is sufficient to say that I have worked hard and trebled my money in 4 years. I have since tried to lead a more intellectual and a better life, and my plans for the future—" He stopped suddenly. He remembered that his plans for the future had been arranged for by Jordison. "Is there anything more you want to know?" he broke out, fiercely and sullenly. "Nothing," replied Jordison faintly. "Do you believe what you have already heard?" "I believe you," the man replied. Then he buried his face in his hands, and his whole frame trembled with emotion, with joy at his son's innocence, with agony at the blood-stained record of his own life. And there, in the quiet depths of the earth, he silently vowed once more to keep all knowledge of his identity from his son, and prayed that he might have the strength to keep his vow to the end. End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of The Black Motor Car. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Painter. The Black Motor Car by Harris BURLAND. Chapter 30. Vengeance is Mine. "I only ask 2 things of you," said Jordison, "and then you shall both go free." He was standing by the iron gate at the end of the tunnel. Arthur Holm and Lady Agnes Cliff both faced him. Their wrists were still bound, but their faces glowed with the light of a great joy. They had been very near to death, but now life, and all that life meant to them, was within their grasp. Suddenly, and for no apparent reason, the man who had held them in his cruel grip had bid them both go free. The night was over, and the day was at hand. The sun itself, now rising from the east and turning the wide expanse of wet sand into a glory of gold, was not so resplendent as the light of freedom that had suddenly flashed up from the dark horizon of pain and death. "I only ask 2 things of you," repeated Jordison, "but you must swear on the Holy Cross that you will do them. In the first place, you must both swear never to reveal, either directly or indirectly, this hiding place of mine, nor give any assistance either direct or indirect, to those who desire to capture me." "I will swear that," replied Holmes sternly, "though God knows what evil I shall do the community." Lady Agnes murmured some words to the same effect, and Jordison produced a small bone cross. "This cross," he said, "was found in these caverns, in the bony fingers of a man who perhaps died for his faith in the time of the Romans. It is, without doubt, a most holy and sacred relic. You will each swear the oaths I desire, by your God and the hope of your future salvation, and you will each kiss this symbol of your faith to seal the words you have spoken." Holmes swore the desired oath, and kissed the little cross. Then Lady Agnes did the same, repeating the words in a faint and faltering voice, and shuddering as her lips touched the bone symbol of early Christianity. "Now," continued Jordison, "you must each swear to me a separate oath. You, Arthur Home, must swear that you will tell Lady Agnes Cliff the true story of your life, and that you will marry her before a year has passed. You, Lady Agnes Cliff, must swear that you will marry the man you love, in spite of all opposition on the part of your parents. There is nothing disgraceful in his past history. He is a true and sterling man. I have done him a great wrong, and I intend to repair it. Do you both agree to swear these oaths?" The two young people looked at each other in bewilderment. They could hardly believe their ears. Jordison had attempted both their lives, and now, as an alternative to death, he asked them to swear to fulfil the dearest wish of their hearts. They could understand the necessity of the first oath, but the second was incomprehensible. "Why?" began Home in a stammering voice. "Don't ask any questions," broke in Jordison savagely and abruptly, "for I shan't answer them. Will you swear?" "I will, so help me God," Home said fervently. "If Lady Agnes—" and he stopped and looked inquiringly at the woman he loved. "Yes, Arthur," she said faintly, her white face flushed with crimson, and there was a tender light in her eyes. They both swore the oath, and once more they kissed the cross. "The hard way goes round to the back of the island," said Jordison. "Keep close to the land until you come to a white piece of rock. Then strike across the sand in a straight line between the white rock and a black post on the shore beyond the salt marsh. You will then find a road and have no difficulty in reaching home. Be sure and keep the straight line between the points I have named. On either side of you lies an enemy that will not be as merciful to you as William Jordison." With these words Jordison took out a knife and cut their bonds, and they were free. Without another word he unlocked the iron gate, and swinging it back on its hinges, stood aside to let them pass. They went out together without a word. Jordison watched their figures disappear round the end of the tunnel. He closed the gate with a crash and locked it. Then he turned abruptly on his heel, and picking up a lamp from the ground, retraced his steps into the tunnel. And so William Jordison went back into the darkness, and his son went out into the light. 12 hours later, the black car stood in the centre of the cavern, ready for its last journey. Jordison had decided to run it to within a few miles of Liverpool before daybreak, and to make his way from that port to America. He had shaved his beard and moustache, and his gaunt face looked wolfish and hideous in its nakedness. Lip had packed such things as they required for the voyage in 2 trunks, and placed them on the car. Concealed about their clothes, sewn here and there in linings, scattered singly, so as to escape the notice of the most diligent customs officer, were £50,000 worth of jewels. They had been picked from the settings, and occupied an amount of space that was ridiculously small compared to their value. Lip lit the lamps, and the 2 men took their seats in the car. Then Jordison started the engines, and a few seconds later they glided through the open door and slipped down the long, narrow passage to the sea. When they emerged into the open, the moon was shining brightly over the waste of sand and water. Jordison steered slowly round the island till he reached the white rock. Then he turned off at right angles and made straight for a twinkling speck of yellow in the west. The black post was invisible in the night, but this light, which shone from the West Ray lightship, lay some 10 miles beyond in the same straight line. They crossed the dangerous sands in safety, though every now and then a sudden sinking of the wheel warned the driver that he had run over the edge of the track. They then glided up a gentle slope, passed over the edge of the bank which kept the tide out of the low-lying land, and went slowly westward over the marshes. The road was execrable. It was little more than a grass track, and the stones that had originally formed its foundation protruded through the thin layer of soil. It ran parallel to the road leading to the Red House some 8 miles north of it, and joined the old Roman causeway. It had been originally constructed to bring up sand and shingle from the beach, but had not been used for many years. Where it joined the causeway, it had sunk several inches, and was submerged for 10 yards in a shallow lake of water. On either side of it lay many miles of desolate marshland. When the motor car reached the main road, Jordison turned to the left and went southward. Lip pointed out in picturesque language that this was not the way to Liverpool. "I am aware of that, Lip," Jordison replied grimly. "I have to call at Heatherstone Hall first." Lip pointed out the risk and broke into a torrent of oaths at Jordison's foolhardiness. But the latter intimated that his servant could leave the car then and there if he liked, and Lip relapsed into sullen silence. Shortly after 11 o'clock, the car glided under the shadows of the overhanging trees in the park. Jordison alighted and told Lip to keep his eyes and ears open. If anyone discovered the car, he was to run straight back to the cavern. He, Jordison, would understand what had happened and could make his way to their hiding place on foot. When he had given these final instructions, he climbed over the wall and made his way through the plantation into the park. His gaunt face looked horrible in the moonlight. The loss of his beard and moustache laid bare all the evil lines of his features. The head of a vulture peering round for the dead carcass of man or beast was not more loathly to look upon. And Jordison's errand that night was death. He had resolved to kill Marie de la Mothe before he left England. Then, at last, his life work would be accomplished. He had found his son and provided for the young man's future happiness. It only remained to pay the debt he owed to the woman who had made him the thing he was. His unbalanced mind, no longer able to distinguish between right and wrong, saw no evil in the thing he was about to do. The cold-blooded murder of a defenceless woman had assumed the appearance of a splendid act of justice. Jordison compared himself to an executioner who carries out the sentence of the law. No criminal, he argued to himself, was more worthy of death than this woman. She had taken no life, but she had ruined that which was more precious than mere physical existence, the soul of a man who might have done much good, but who had sunk lower than the beasts that perish. Jordison saw nothing of his own free will in the matter. He only saw that all the misery and crime of his life lay at the door of Marie de la Mothe, and for that he had sentenced her to death. He crept slowly through the park, moving on all fours from tree to tree, and crawling slowly to the great white house that glistened in the moonlight. He was but a small black patch on the grass, to the eye of his God no more than a wolf advancing on his prey, but to himself the stern shadow of impending doom, resistless, glorious in his purpose, inevitable. In either pocket lay a heavy loaded revolver, and he carried a dozen spare cartridges. But these weapons were only to be used in case of discovery, when he might be cornered and have to fight for his life. For the purpose of his mission he trusted to a pair of muscular hands, the primeval weapons of man. When he reached the house, he was surprised to see that it was in darkness. Not a single light appeared in the long line of windows, save that which the glass reflected back from the moon. As a rule, the Heatherstones entertained largely when they were in residence, and had guests at dinner nearly every night in the week. But tonight they had evidently gone to bed early, and Jordison was grateful for the good fortune which had smiled on his enterprise. It was, in his own mind, but one more proof that he was a chosen instrument of justice. He crept cautiously through the shrubbery, and made his way to the north side of the house. He effected an entrance through one of the windows of the servants' hall, and taking off his boots, groped his way to the foot of the big staircase. He ascended this, and found himself in a long corridor, dimly lit by 2 gas jets, turned down to small bluish tongues of flame. He walked along it on tiptoe, and came into another and wider corridor, thickly carpeted, and leading to the principal bedrooms of the east wing. Here he was on known ground, and had no difficulty in locating the door of the Countess's bedroom. It was, as he had ascertained many months previously, the 3rd door from the end of the corridor. He placed his fingers on the handle, and turning it softly, opened the door. Once again good fortune was on his side, for after the burglaries at Heatherstone Hall, it was more than probable that it would have been locked. The room was in total darkness. He entered quickly, and closing the door behind him, turned the key. Once in the room, and out of the light of the passage, he breathed more securely. He leaned against the wall and listened. There was absolute silence. His hand touched the switch of the electric light. Then he hesitated. Though he knew that heaven would applaud his deed, he had no wish to see the thing he was about to do. No, she should die there in the darkness. It was a more fitting end to her life. He held his breath and listened again. He thought it odd that he could not hear the sound of her breathing. The sudden thought struck him that he had perhaps, after all, mistaken the room, or that the family had left Heatherstone Hall, and that Lady Heatherstone, departing from her habits of over 2 years, had gone with them. Once more he placed his hand upon the switch, and once more he hesitated. Then he crept stealthily from the wall, and as he moved across the soft carpet to the bed, he suddenly noticed that there was a strange smell in the room, a sweet, sickly smell like perfume or the scent of hothouse flowers. For some reason or other, it brought back a vivid memory of a scene in his past life, the first day he had ever kissed Marie de la Mothe. He remembered it well. She was pinning a gardenia in his buttonhole. When he reached the edge of the bed, he stopped and again listened. Then he passed his hand lightly over the coverlet, and discovered that there was someone lying beneath it. Then he moved his fingers along the recumbent form and across a pair of folded arms, till they touched the outline of a face hidden beneath a piece of velvet. He knew then that it was the face of the Countess of Heatherstone. He passed his hands under the edge of the mask, and suddenly gripped the throat. But directly his fingers closed on the neck, he whipped his hands away, and staggered back from the bed, with difficulty suppressing a cry of horror. The flesh was cold as marble, and the chill of it went through his whole body from head to foot. He crept through the darkness till he found the switch by the door. Then he turned the light on and looked toward the bed. There lay the Countess of Heatherstone, with her arms folded across her breast, and a cross of white flowers at her feet. William Jordison went over and looked at her long and earnestly. The white hand of death had hidden the ravages of disease, as snow hides the ugliness of a devastated land. Then suddenly he stepped forward, and replacing the velvet mask on her face, crept from the room like a beaten hound. God had taken her punishment into his own hands, and William Jordison knew that his Maker had discarded him, as a man discards a broken knife. End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of The Black Motor Car. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Painter. The Black Motor Car by Harris BURLAND. Chapter 31. The Last Ride. When Jordison, white-faced and panting, reached the edge of the plantation, he paused and listened. He heard the sound of a voice, sharp, querulous, and insistent. He could not catch the words, but he could distinguish lips growl in reply. Then he heard two other voices, stern and deep-toned, and then a reply that was unmistakable, the report of a revolver. Then the sound of 3 shots fired almost simultaneously, and then a loud cry, and 2 voices talking together in low tones. Jordison crept softly through the copse to the wall, on his hands and knees, and pulled out his revolver. "You cursed fool," he heard a voice say. "You've jacked up the whole concern now. Yes, he's dead enough, but it's only the servant. The other is bound to have heard the firing and cleared off. Poor old Saunders, he's done for. Stop your jaw, Williams, and get our car out of sight. We'll have—" Thin tongue of fire spat out from Jordison's revolver, and the man lurched forward to the ground. His companion turned, fired, and hit the stone coping by Jordison's head. Before he could fire again, 2 bullets were in his body, and he reeled over onto the road. Jordison looked sharply round to see if any more men were concealed in the shadow under the trees. He could distinguish nothing in the darkness, but he argued that they would all have emerged onto the road after the first melee with Lip and climbed swiftly over the wall. A large motor car stood in the middle of the road, and 3 bodies lay in various attitudes on the ground. He cast a hasty glance at them and turned his attention to Lip. His servant had fallen forward over the steering wheel. His face was red with blood, and he was quite dead. Jordison lifted the limp figure to the ground, and for one brief moment a pang of sorrow touched his hard heart. This fellow, vile and brutal as he was, had been a faithful servant, even to the end. But it was no time for sentiment. Jordison, remembering the hidden jewels, stripped the coat off the dead man and flung it into the bottom of the car. Then he took his seat, started the engines, gripped the steering wheel that was wet with blood, and pulled the lever. The car glided out of the shadow of the trees, made a half circle, and moved northward along the Roman causeway, gathering speed with every mile it went. When it ran inland from the Essex marshes, it was travelling at 90 miles an hour. The driver's white stern face was bent forward, and his eyes never left the road before him for the 1,000th part of a second. Jordison realized that he must get within walking distance of Liverpool that night. He was afraid to take the simpler form of locomotion that the railway offered. He guessed that every station was watched. He knew that, after the disappearance of Arthur Holm and Lady Agnes Cliff, hue and cry would be raised over the whole of England, and that every county would again blossom forth in amateur detectives and ardent motorists pursuing each other persistently. It was clear, too, that men were abroad that night who meant business. The 4 dead bodies at the foot of Heatherstone Park testified to that much, at any rate. Jordison knew that his only hope of escape lay in the darkness. He could slip past his pursuers under cover of the night, but with the rising of the sun he would have to abandon the car and take to some less conspicuous means of progress. Whatever happened, he had to reach Liverpool that night. He slipped through Essex into Hertfordshire, and it was not till he reached the smooth slopes by Royston that any further incident occurred. Here a large white car dashed suddenly out of a by-road, missed his hind wheels by a foot, and tore madly after him up a long, gentle incline. To use a colloquial but expressive phrase, he "left it standing," but he did not get away before its occupants, 3 Cambridge undergraduates, had examined him thoroughly in the light of their lamps. 25 minutes later the white car spun into Cambridge, woke up the police and the telegraph office, and the news began to flash through the length and breadth of England that William Jordison was tearing northward under cover of the night. Fast as the black car flew, the telegrams flew faster, and every town north of Cambridge that had a telegraph office open at that hour of the night spread out its news by rail and bicycle and telephone, till more than half of the police in England knew that there was no chance of sleep for them till the morning. It was a bad lookout for the drivers of dark cars, and before sunrise many of them regretted their choice of colour for the bodies of their machines. They were stopped, haled off to police stations, led into traps, and even fired at by reckless and enthusiastic pursuers. It was a night never to be forgotten by the motorists of England. Jordison at first recked little of the tumult he had aroused over the whole of the country. He knew that the occupants of the white car would give the alarm, probably at Cambridge or Bedford, but he guessed that the police were heartily sick of false alarms, and that they would move slowly and cautiously in the matter. What he did not know, however, was that one of the undergraduates was the son of the Home Secretary, and that his name was sufficient to raise a faint hope of promotion in the heart of every inspector in the country. Jordison steered a course midway between Cambridge and Bedford, and passing through St. Neots and Kimbleton, made his way westward into Northamptonshire. On a by-road between Kettering and Wellingborough, he first became aware of the storm he had raised. A policeman on a bicycle suddenly flashed out of the darkness into the light of his lamps. The man cried out to him to stop, flung himself off his machine just in time to save his life, saw his bicycle tossed into the air, and then vanished in the darkness behind. In 2 minutes' time Jordison had reached the next village, and saw the flare of lanterns in the street. A dozen burly labourers armed with axes, billhooks, and pitchforks blocked the way. He drove full speed at them, and they sprang aside. One of them was too late. There was a jolt and a scream, and an axe whizzed past Jordison's ear. He looked back and saw the lights clustered round something on the ground. Then he laughed. He was beginning to see that motorists would have a lively time that night. This was but the first of a series of incidents. Before he had passed through Leicestershire, he had run over 2 policemen, smashed a dog cart to pieces, and received 5 pellets from a gun in his left arm. 4 revolver bullets had struck the car, and 1 had chipped a piece off the steering wheel. He was now getting into a more densely populated county, and many of the inhabitants of Staffordshire were on the roads to meet him. The police had now had time to lay traps for him, and the whole country, a veritable network of telegraph and telephone wires, followed his movements almost as accurately as though they had been lined out in red ink on a map. His light showed him the road 100 yards ahead, and he avoided most of these traps, baulks of timber, carts, etc., by stopping the car, reversing the engines, and running backward till he could turn down a side road. But they caused him endless annoyance, and the constant turning and twisting began to so confuse his sense of locality that he had more than once to consult a small compass. It was not, however, till he was on the borders of Shropshire that he encountered the racing car which was destined to play so memorable a part in the events of that night. It came on him suddenly at right angles, as he was running at half speed over the join of 4 crossroads. To avoid a collision he was forced to wrench his car round to the left and run westward. The driver of the grey car, which was running at full speed, jammed on his brakes and swerved to the right to avoid a collision. As it was, he ran level with Jordison's car for 50 yards. There were 3 people in the car, and they yelled out to Jordison to stop. But before they could recover the pace they had lost by putting on the brakes, he had worked his engines almost up to the top speed, and had shot ahead of them. Jules Simon, the driver of the grey car, had just come from the great speed trials at Manchester, and in his pocket reposed the gold medal he had wrested from some of the finest cars in England. His machine was own sister to the one Lord Harry Quay had purchased, and in the hands of a driver who had few equals either in England or the Continent, it had performed wonders. With a flying start, it had covered the mile in 33 seconds, and in a subsequent test had been the first car in the world to run 100 miles in the hour. On his way back to London, Jules Simon had received the news about Jordison at Whitchurch, and rousing a local gunmaker from his sleep, had purchased a revolver and a box of 50 cartridges before proceeding on his way southward. As Jordison shot forward into the darkness, 2 bullets sang past him, very wide of their mark, but an unpleasant reminder that he might be the victim of a chance shot from an unskilled hand. He shouted at them derisively, but could not reply in their own fashion. Both his hands were required for the steering wheel, and he could not take his eyes from the white strip of ground that unwound itself into the darkness. Jordison cursed the ill luck that had driven him out of his course, but he had resolved to take the first turning to the right and work his way back to the north. He had no doubt when he passed the other car that he would soon leave it so far behind that he could safely slacken speed before turning a corner. But in this particular case, Jordison had reckoned without his host. 5 minutes after he had passed his pursuers, he cast a hasty glance backward, and saw the light of the other car a bare half-mile behind him. In a flash he realized that this only meant the difference between 2 cars of almost equal speed, one of which had been obliged to work up its pace after a liberal use of the brakes. He realized, too, that the distance between them, at the pace at which both were travelling, represented a bare 15 seconds of time, and that any diminution of speed on his part would probably bring the other car crashing into him before he could round a corner. And even if this were not so, he saw that his pursuers would be able to keep so close to him that he would in all likelihood be unable to get clear away from them. This would effectually prevent him from abandoning the car before he reached Liverpool, and if he encountered another trap on the road, would mean an encounter from which he would probably be unable to escape with his life. The question of petrol had also to be considered. He had run now 250 miles, and another 400 would exhaust his supply. He had counted on being able, in case of absolute necessity, to break open some petrol store and get as much as he wanted. This would be impossible now that all the countryside was up in arms against him, and doubly impossible with a fast racing car clinging to his heels. Jordison at last realized that fortune was against him, and he decided to run back to his hiding place and trust to having better luck another night. He gradually worked his way round to the south-east, and leaving Shrewsbury on his left, ran down into Worcestershire, crossed the Severn, put his car at the great slopes of the Cotswold Hills, and spun over this wide tableland till he shot down into the green valley of the Thames. By the time he had left Woodstock on his right, his pursuers were quite 2 miles behind him. Every now and then, at the end of some long straight stretch of road, or on the slopes of some hill, he caught a glimpse of their lamps. Drive as he would, and he drove like a maniac that night, he could not shake them off, but he was slowly wresting the ground from them, foot by foot, and he calculated that, by the time he reached Essex, he would be far enough ahead to slip unobserved into his hiding place. The pursuit, save for that single car which had clung to him for over 100 miles, seemed to have died away. He encountered no obstacles, and he flashed through sleeping villages unseen and unopposed. The bark of a dog, the neigh of a horse, the distant rattle of a train, the hoot of an owl, were the only sounds to break the silence, save the low hiss of the wheels beneath him. The clamour and awakening of the night, which had hemmed him in on every side in the populous north, had completely died away. He congratulated himself on having decided to return to his place of concealment, and on having chosen so quiet a route. The real truth of the matter was, however, that he was still supposed to be running northward, and that the double back to the south had upset all the elaborate police arrangements for his capture. The officials at Cambridge had drawn an imaginary line passing through Hawryluk, Warwick, Cambridge, and Ipswich, and had only had time to telegraph to a few large towns south of that line. The black car had now run nearly 400 miles, and the strain of the headlong rush through the darkness would have shattered the nerves of any ordinary man. But William Jordison was scarcely human that night. No automaton of steel and iron could have been less susceptible to fatigue or fear. He had become a soulless machine, with 2 rigid hands riveted to the steering wheel, and with 2 motionless eyes fixed on the road before him. The great car that hummed and vibrated beneath him was more a thing of life than the man who steered it on its course. His thoughts were neither of the past nor the future, neither of the dead woman nor of a living son, neither of misery nor happiness, neither of fear nor love nor hate. They were only occupied and centred on one thing. The road with its white surface, its blurred hedges, and its signposts flashing up mile after mile and directing him on his way. As he passed to the north of Aylesbury, the wind rose, and driving sheets of rain beat into his face and blurred his sight, and turned the clean road into a stream of soft mud. Signposts became illegible, and he steered like a sailor by the compass, running due east and hoping to strike the Essex road at some point where his local knowledge would be of service to him. The lights of the grey car had vanished altogether in the blinding curtain of rain, and he knew that his own lamps would be invisible. There was no longer any danger of being overtaken, but there was every prospect of his not finding the old Roman causeway. The south-easterly wind increased in violence until it became a gale. The rain did not cease, but was driven against him like points of steel. The great car hissed through the storm with a resistless force, but its speed was materially reduced. The roadway flew up from the wheels in streams and fountains of mud. Jordison, grim and immovable, was drenched as though he had just emerged from the sea. At last, though he knew it not, he crossed the borders of Hertfordshire and rushed into Essex. He could not see more than 50 yards in front of him. He only knew that he was still going into the east. Upward slopes, downward grades, flat stretches of level road conveyed nothing to his mind. His sense of locality was gone. The east, the sea line, was his only boundary. When he reached it, fortune alone would take him north or south to his destination. Then, at last, the boundary came out at him like a flash out of the darkness. There was a sudden roughening of the road, the crunch of shingle and clatter of stones, and he brought his car to a dead stop. Looking round, he could see nothing but stones and sand, with a patch of sea lavender and a glistening curtain of water that streamed like a silvery waterfall from the dark heavens above. End of chapter 31.
Chapter 32 of The Black Motor Car. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Conway. The Black Motor Car by BURLAND. Chapter 32. The Road on the Sands. Jordison dismounted from the car and listened attentively. He could hear nothing but the roar of the wind and rain. It was evident that the sea was some way from him. Then he took the oil tail light from its bracket and proceeded to examine the shore. It was absolutely necessary for him to discover whether he lay north or south of his destination. He walked nearly a quarter of a mile in either direction, but he discovered nothing that afforded any clue to his whereabouts. The low flat land and the beach strewn with its waving lines of sticks, corks and rubbish, the narrow little creeks of glistening mud, the small islets of green herbage on the sands themselves were common to most of the coastline of Essex. On every side the rain descended and blotted out all landmarks that did not lie close to his feet. Seaward no lightship twinkled through the gloom, and inland there was nothing to be seen from which he could glean a single shred of information. He retraced his steps to the car and consulted the compass. The shore ran north and south. That much at least was certain, but whether the triplets lay to the south or to the north was more than he could tell from the meagre information at his disposal. He made up his mind to work his way slowly inland until he reached some signpost or some point from which he could trace his way to the Roman road. He drew out a piece of bread from under the seat and devoured it eagerly, like a wolf tearing at a lump of flesh. Then he drank a quarter of a pint of neat brandy, lit a pipe and resumed his seat in the car. Scarcely, however, had he buttoned the leather rug over his knees when his ears caught a new sound from out of the night. The faint beat and throb of engines in the distance, only distinguishable from the roar of the wind by the regular rhythm which gradually increased in volume and distinctness. He turned round and saw two faint specks of light through the driving rain, and even as he looked they increased in size. Quick as thought he pulled up a chain beneath his feet and started his engines. It was a moment in which a matter of life and death had to be decided in a few seconds of time. Behind him lay a closed road, before him the sand and the sea. A man's mind moves quickly in moments like these. First he thought it would be best to turn round and drive straight at them. If they moved aside, he escaped. If they stood in his path, they died or were broken. And he too would either be killed outright or so horribly maimed that he could not escape. Then he thought that he would abandon the car and slink away into the marshes under cover of the night, trusting to good fortune to make the triplets at the next tide. Both these plans were cast aside as soon as they were formed. The first because it would be next to impossible to turn his car and get any speed on his engines before the other car was upon him. And second because he would have to abandon his ultimate means of reaching some large port from which he could elude the vigilance of the police and escape from the country. There was only one third course open to him, and he took it. He pulled the lever and the great car crashed and rattled down the shingle toward the sea. Here, at any rate, his pursuers might well hesitate to follow. Few men cared to make their way over the Essex flats after dark on foot. No one but a man who cared nothing for his life would rush on to their treacherous surface in a heavy motor car. He ground through the rattling shingle and heard the soft squelch of mud beneath his wheels. Before he had run 100 yards towards the sea, the cries of voices rose above the storm, and looking back, he saw the yellow eyes of the pursuing car glaring at him from the bank of the shingle. A second later, 3 bullets sang over his head. He had no time to reply, but moved his lever on to the next speed, and as he did so, a thin switch rose up wet and glistening on his right and vanished into the darkness. He turned his car round and made for it, and before he reached it, the wheels rolled up from soft slime onto a hard jolting surface, and another switch gleamed in the light of his lamps. And then at last he realised where he was. For 8 miles along the coast of Essex, and at a distance of some 200 yards from the shore, there runs a hard way of firm sand, strengthened and compacted by thousands of tons of ballast. Every half-mile or so a similar track runs off at right angles to it and joins some road on the land. The island which it skirts used at one time to depend almost entirely for its means of communication on this veritable sea road. The scattered hamlets dotted here and there along its coast were so cut off from each other by creeks and inlets that they found this the simplest method of overcoming their difficulties. The hard way was marked out by slender switches planted in the sand. It had been little used since the introduction of new roads and bridges on the island itself, but occasionally a cart toiled along its dreary surface, or some belated fisherman stranded on the sands, which run out here nearly 6 miles at low tide, crawled homeward along it, a mere black speck of a man with his face ever turned towards the grey line of sea. For the path had claimed many victims in its time. Some had been washed away by the encroaching tide, others, less fortunate, had splashed shoreward through the rising waters and been sucked down into the sands that never gave up their dead. Jordison was in that mood which risks everything on the single cast of a die, and, besides, a cornered man cannot be over careful in his methods. The southerly end of the hard way lay within 2 miles of his hiding place. If he could reach the end of it in safety, it would be easy work to go inland and make his way round to the road which ran down to his own path across the sands. It was more than an even chance that his pursuers would not care to follow him to the end. They were strangers to the district and knew nothing of the road. The fear of the sea would be in their minds, and the treacherous sands on either side of them would soon tell them of the terrible doom that lurked in the darkness. They had little to gain and much to lose. Jordison, on the other hand, had nothing to lose and much to gain. He guided his motor onto the hard way and ran southward at 20 miles an hour. It was a hideous night, drenched with rain and icy with a northeaster that had risen into a gale. On the flat sand, with no shelter to the east or west, Jordison felt the full fury of the storm. It beat down on him with a hiss of wind and waters. It seemed as though heaven itself was crashing down from the sky above and trying to beat the life out of him. On either side, the dun sands faded away into the darkness. Switches flashed up and disappeared. More than once the car lurched over as a wheel sank into the soft, cruel bed that watched and waited for a man's life. But the powerful car broke from the fetters before they became too strong and hurled itself back onto safe ground. At the end of 5 minutes, Jordison looked back. Not a light was to be seen. He was alone in the darkness. The occupants of the other car had either been afraid to follow him or else were some way behind in the chase. It was even possible that they had run off the causeway and that they were held for all time in the grip of the quicksands. Jordison brought his car to a dead stop and listened. He fancied he could hear the shriek of human voices, but the sound was scarcely to be distinguished from the howling of the wind. Yet he shuddered at the picture it called up to his imagination. He was a man who had passed through many dangers and who scarcely knew what it was to be afraid. But as he had sat there and listened to the wind, he was seized with a sudden fear, born of the darkness and the solitude and the death that lurked on either side of him. It crept up to him and sprang suddenly as a beast springs on its prey, and gripped his heart till he almost cried out with terror. It came up across the miles of dun sand from the sea, a silent shadow with noiseless feet. It was not in the thunder nor the earthquake, but in the still small voice. It was the herald of the God to whom vengeance belongeth. For 5 minutes William Jordison sat motionless, and the sleeting arrows of silver rain seemed to weave a network over his eyes and brain. He was powerless to move, helpless, a shivering coward, weak as a child. And then the fear left him as suddenly as it came. He roused himself to action, resolved to take the first turning landward, and once more sent the black car gliding through the storm. Before he had gone 100 yards, however, the bright fan of light before him suddenly dimmed. There was a faint fizzle, and the acetylene lamps went out. He stopped the car and examined them. The carbide was exhausted into a mere heap of grey dust. He had no more on the car. A single oil lamp, a mere candle after the white glare of the Blériot lights, was all that he had left to guide him through the perils of that road across the sands. He started once more on his journey, but slowly, as one who feels his way in the darkness. And, as he moved forward, fear once again crept softly into the car and sat by his side. The shadows of the sands seemed to be gathering more deeply around him. The glare of the acetylene had been dimmed into a feeble yellow light of the oil lamp, and the strong spirit that had burned within Jordison's iron frame died down into a flickering flame. The man's nerve was gone. He had been strung up to concert pitch, and the cord had snapped. Dangers which he would have laughed at a couple of hours before loomed gigantic upon him out of the darkness. The wide flats stretching eastward and the lonely marshes that bounded the quicksands to the west were thickly peopled for him that night. The ghosts of the dead the sea had given to the shore, and the dead that the sands would never disgorge till the day of judgment, moaned and gibbered at him through the storm. Marie de la Mothe floated white and still from the web of the rain, and he could smell the scent of hothouse flowers. His wife crouched by a dripping switch to his left. Jeremy and Susanson crawled along by the wheels. Lip, with his sullen scowl, sat by his side, and his presence was cold as the northeaster that beat across from the sea. The black heavens moved with countless whirling images, and uncouth faces and arms were thrust up from the yellow sands to mock at him. In the dim light and in the tumult of his disordered brain, Jordison passed one of the bypaths to the shore, and before he reached the next he heard a new sound among the voices of the night, the low splash of water, a feeble sound compared to the whistling and shrieking of the gale, but insistent and continuous. The first faint pulsing of the mighty ocean, the tip of the forefinger of a resistless arm. A few seconds later a smooth, thin fold of water was flung across the path, and the wheels sent up a tiny spurt of spray. Jordison awoke from the terrors of his overwrought brain to the real danger that faced him. He cast a hurried glance at his watch and realised in a flash that he had miscalculated the tide by at least half an hour, and that the northeaster, which was heaping up the waters on the land, had magnified this error into one of serious importance. He quickened his pace so as to gain the next turning while there was still some chance of following out the road. The thin film of water, harmless in itself, was yet enough to blur sand and causeway into an indistinguishable plain of sea. As the car shot forward, tiny waves began to ripple across its path, and the wheels churned them into the white foam in a continuous shower of spray. The tide runs up the North Ray Flats with incredible swiftness, and, with an easterly wind behind it, it slopes along like a mill race. Before Jordison had gone another quarter of a mile, it was nearly up to his axles, and the great car shuddered as it ploughed the waters into creamy foam. Jordison's whole body was cold as a marble statue. His indomitable spirit was beaten down and crushed by the elements. The hissing rain, the shrieking and buffeting wind, the surging waters, the impenetrable darkness all closed on him in unison. He had to fight them single-handed, with such strength as one man may have, and the throbbing force of the machinery beneath him. He was drenched from head to foot, and the car ran with water. But his strong fingers gripped the steering wheel like a vise, and he still imagined in his own heart that he would gain the victory. Yet how simple a thing will alter the destiny of a man's life! The crossroads to the shore were marked by two switches set close together on either side of the turning. These switches differed from the others that marked the main road by having old tin cans hung from the top of them. Now it so happened that a week before the events narrated in this chapter, a small boy, on mischief bent, had moved one of these cans and converted it into a treasure house for various stones and bits of glass that he had gathered from the beach. Jordison passed this switch and, coming to the next one with its tin can, turned sharply to the right, thinking it to be the first of the two guideposts, though it was in reality the second. The great car spun round in the water with the surge of a liner turning in the trough of an angry sea. Then the fore part of it sank and shivered and stopped suddenly, and Jordison was flung out from his seat into 2 feet of water. He scrambled to his feet and rose dripping from the sea. He still thought he was on the hard way, and quickly resolved to leave the car and struggle shoreward on foot. The yellow lamp still shed its gleam over the waters, and the black car loomed behind it like a wreck marked out by the Trinity House authorities. Jordison raised one foot to step forward, and found to his horror that he was gripped by the ankle. Then he tried the other, but something had laid hold of it by the calf. He exerted all his great strength and tore one foot from the bonds that clasped it, but the movement thrust the other farther into the sand. It was buried now almost to the knee, and the water came above his waist. The light of the car was but 2 yards from him. If he could only reach it, there would be at least something solid beneath his feet. He flung himself on his face and swam so as to keep his head above water. One leg was free, and he was careful not to touch the sand with that foot, but the other was slowly being sucked down. A wolf with one paw in a trap was better circumstanced than William Jordison in that hour. The trap holds, but cannot draw its victim into its jaws. Jordison took most of the weight off his body by swimming, but the quicksand seemed to have a peculiar power of suction apart from the weight of the thing they grasped. His efforts only prolonged the agony. Inch by inch he was drawn down into the depths until the sand reached nearly to his waist. Again and again he flung himself forward and tried to reach the car, which was itself sinking down into the same doom. Once he got within 6 inches of it, but never afterward so near. The water surged past him in little waves. He shrieked aloud and called upon the God who had forsaken him. His only answer was the howl of the wind and the splash of many waters. Then suddenly the light of the car sank beneath the sea, and there was darkness. And in that darkness William Jordison died. End of chapter 32. Recording by Drew Conway, Kent. End of The Black Motor Car by Harris Burland.